Today, presenting on anger management for adolescents, please welcome Mark Myers.
Hello, welcome everyone to the webinar here. We're without audio, so we're going to be a little bit challenged here. Today's presentation is on anger management for adolescents, helping them to help themselves. Next slide. Defining anger. When we all experience anger. It's a natural human emotion, just like any other emotion. It communicates to us in the outside world how we're seeing or feeling. Now, people have their own individual standards for anger. What some people may perceive as anger, others may not. It's user-defined, and it can be interpreted differently by others. So if someone has a family history of aggressive behavior, being acceptable at dinner, someone visiting the house for the first time may want to hide under the table, and the other family may be viewing that as just a natural exchange of information. When we talk about the teen's view of anger next, that we're kind of going into a different realm over here. Teens' view of anger, their perspective and how they handle anger may be more of an oh well. They may not see anger as being a problem, but rather as expressing themselves in an obvious way and having to deal with parental or authority ineptness or inability to get it. Now, the parent view may be a lot different. Their view may be looking at it as just something that's certainly creating a challenge for the family. So we have a difference between the teen view and the parent view. Next. So let's kind of get a little bit more information here about what as far as definitions. Anger, again, it's a normal emotion. It's not necessarily good or bad. And we want to distinguish it between aggression, hostility, rage, and violence. These are all different entities here. So what anger could look like in a teenager, next, and here's how it may present itself. Behaviorally, they may be avoiding. There may be some physical presentations of it. We could see sleep problems, grumbling, frequent complaints, criticism, sarcasm. So these are all manifestations of how anger may present themselves. And again, each teen will be different. Next. We want to look to help the parents understand what the function of anger is. We need to take a lot of concerns into consideration. Developmental tasks. This is a time when kids are naturally distancing themselves from parents. Peer interactions, brain development. We'll talk more about that later. And these are self-avoidance. So there's also some of these things as far as how anger looks and how anger presents itself. It comes out differently for each child. And what we look at is we really want to examine what exactly are they trying to tell us. What function is it? What do we see? What are they trying to communicate to us? So what we want to look at is some other factors that may be involved in anger. Timing, when does it happen? With whom does it happen? The environment, cultural considerations, the family history. How does a family normally express their anger? And also consequences of anger. Now, some of the things to keep in mind is for some adolescents, anger and the presentation of anger could serve a vital function. For them, it could just get parents to back off. So in order to, except for it gets the parents, or excuse me, it gets the adolescent be able to step in, get the parents to backing off, and that could serve a function as well. So in order to address anger, we really need to get a better understanding of all these different factors. Now, the costs of anger are pretty clear. It affects family relationships, poor communication. What I mentioned before is there's also a lack of accountability. Meaning if a parent is backing off and allowing a behavior for a teenager to continue, that teenager is not going to be invested into any change. What we also want to be aware of established patterns. So if we don't address some of these issues right now, these are concerns that could certainly follow into adulthood. We're also, the cost will be poor coping skills, where we'd be concerned about their inability to be able to communicate and deal with emotions, and let alone communicate to the outside world. Physical consequences, costs, peer relations. These are in legal implications as well. Some of the things to keep in mind is that adolescence is really a learning period, and they're practicing to be adults. So if there's an inappropriate expression of anger and it's allowed to continue, these are behaviors that could certainly manifest themselves into bigger problems when they become adults. We also keep in mind that there's a physiological aspect of anger, and this is called the fight or flight, that the brain responds to anger. There's an emotional part of the brain called the limbic system, and it's when we're perceiving a threat, the amygdala hijacks the messages. It overrides the cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is our decision-making, logical part of our brain. The emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, once we're activated and once the body responds and sees a perceived threat, that there's hormones that are released. It's called a hormonal flush. And once this fight or flight is activated, next, it could take up to 20 minutes, next, for this to, for us, for individuals to calm down. So the fight or flight is a primal, it's a primal instinct. We've had it since the beginning of time. And there was a slide that we actually missed that shows the breakdown of this physiological response. So as anger rises in the hypothalamus in the brain, it stimulates the glands, the releasing of the hormone, and activates a whole bunch of our survival systems within our body. When we're looking and talking about adolescence, we also need to keep a perspective in mind. So adolescence is referred to, and I'm not sure where this quote came in, but I certainly feel it certainly hits a mark for a lot of the kids that we work with. It's a big engine, refers to the new push for autonomy. Those are developmental challenges and developmental challenges that kids work through, to developmental tasks. The high octane refers to intense emotions accompanying the hormonal change. I mean, you think about all the different body changes and the hormonal changes that are going on at that age. The poor steering results from the reconstruction of the prefrontal cortex and the emotional hijacking. We talked about that a few minutes ago. In the faulty brakes describes the lack of impulse control. And we could attest to the fact is using a lot of gas, intense emotional and physical energy required to be a teen. So, let's kind of keep in mind, and I think it's important for parents to keep in mind, where their kids are at, where their teens are at, and what they may be capable of. So we're going to get a little bit about teen brain facts. I mentioned about the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of our brain that weighs outcome, forms judgments, and controls impulses. For adolescents, that's a lot less mature than in adults. It develops at a slower rate, and that's one of the last parts of the brain to develop. There's also what's referred to as a pruning process, where our synapses, there's a whole bunch of different, and I'll show you on the next slide, with adolescents, and part of what they do, they have an abundance of different routes that messages are being sent. As they get older, they learn for more efficient and effective ways to transmit some of those messages. And the greatest spurts of growth that happen after infancy occurs during the teenage years. The synapses are, again, where messages are sent from one place to another. And as I mentioned, the pruning process is where, as we learn for more effective and we go through more problem solving our capabilities, that we learn better ways to send messages. So you kind of look at it as the brain develops, we're pruning our circuitry, similar to an entertainment center. So we'll find different ways of sending messages. Okay, we got a little out of sequence here, but this is what I was referring to as the fight or flight. And you could get an understanding of when somebody is in an aroused state or an anger state, that and when the body is reacting this way, it's really hard for reasoning. Logical reasoning may not be at its premium here. Next. Now, we also need to take into consideration the implications of what happens when one gets angry. So right now in today's society, the impact of getting angry is much more significant and consequential than it was in years past. I've worked with several teenagers who, in fits of anger, have put things on Facebook or text or group text, and have wound up having some significant consequences to it. So the social media and technologies allowed faster and quicker ways for us to express our feelings, which is not a good thing. So what we're looking for is teaching kids how to be aware of anger and appropriately express it. This is going to be a learning process for them. So let's talk a little bit more about defining adolescent anger. What we first want to do is distinguish between a can't versus a won't. There are some adolescents who may see their anger or expression of anger as being beneficial. Gets parents to back off, gets them off their case. Avoidance. There's some parents that I've worked with who won't even go, are very reluctant to even ask their kids for some very basic responsibility or task, because they're afraid of their child may explode or get volatile. Now there's a group of kids who just simply can't. It's not about a won't, but they're just really having difficulties in managing their anger. What we want to do is we want to be able to distinguish between an anger problem, or we certainly want to rule out any other problems that may be coexisting or causing the anger to happen. The DSM-5 does address that, and I'm just going to quickly go over this next. What the DSM-5 looks at is the temper, number 2, I just highlighted that. They're inconsistent with developmental level, the frequency, how often they occur, next. Duration, and this is important, that they happen at least in 2 settings, at home or at school or with peers. That goes back to what I was referring to before as far as the function of it. If it's just happening at home, that may give you an indication that there's more control over the anger than the adolescent may lead on to be. So this will be helpful information as far as the DSM-5. I think they hit it right on the head with this as far as looking at more than one setting. And let's, again, keep in mind some developmental tasks and issues with adolescents. There's this natural resistance to authority. Anger is the most acceptable emotion with adolescents than most other negative ones. So you think about it, and working a lot with teens, they they're especially with boys, they're not going to necessarily express sadness, humiliation. It's really going to present himself as being angry. So we want to tell kids it's okay and it's fine to feel angry. And again, it's a good emotion, it's healthy, but we really want to be able to get them to understand how you get angry. So the parent's role, and here's where we start talking about how we could help, or how we could get parents to help their kids. So the parent's role, oftentimes we see parents engaging in power struggles. Certainly parents have the advantage of going through life experiences and not wanting to see their kids make some of the same mistakes. And sometimes we get into more winning our argument as opposed to trying to look at ourselves as teachers. Oftentimes, adolescents are not choosing their altercations. If you ask a child, do you want to wake up in the morning and do you want to have continual fights with their parents, I'm sure most would probably say no to that. But there's a form of communication. They're communicating something to you. And what we also want to make sure is we're role modeling good behavior. And how helpful it is to keep in mind that the kids will be responding to environmental cues. So we talked before about the fight or flight, and if a child is seeing him or herself, I don't know what happened to the screen if that's happening with everyone, but if a child is experiencing the fight or flight and sees a perceived threat, it's going to be a lot harder for that child to manage their own anger. So we certainly want to look at the role modeling and how we're presenting themselves. What we want to do is we want to look and focus on the behavior and not the argument. There's a term I use is referred to as getting lost in the argument. So if a child says it's not fair, this always happens to me, and my brother gets away with this, or he always does this, and that teenager is throwing things around and hitting walls, a parent doesn't want to engage in the argument whether or not that there's fairness going on, but we really want to make our shift towards the anger and keep the anger issue and how they're presenting their anger in the forefront of the conversation. In fact, conversation should not be continued as long as these behaviors are presenting themselves. So the more we're able to shift the focus on the behavior and label it and acknowledge this is what we're seeing, the sooner the adolescent will be able to shift onto their own coping mechanisms and their own and how they're presenting themselves. So this is a very important distinction. Is we want to keep referencing the behavior and what we're seeing and how we see it, and defining it as the anger rather than getting drawn into an argument. So what the parents are going to be doing is they're going to be doing their own information gathering. They want to look at the intensity, the duration, frequency. So we're going to kind of gain some information to see if they could see any functions or patterns themselves. So parent responses, first and foremost, we need to get them to understand and managing the environment. It's not a matter of out yelling your child, and we really, again, want to give them the understanding what we referred to before as a physiological response. We want to give them the opportunity to get the thinking part of their brain more working than the emotional part. That's where we'll point out and label the behavior. We want to hold them accountable. We want to choose our battles, and again, it's not about winning. And as I mentioned before, it's certainly about good role modeling. Next. So as I said, we do respond to environmental cues, and keeping our own anger in check is certainly going to be a big key to all this. And it also goes back to the role modeling. Ross Green came out with a book. This one didn't credit his name, but Managing the Explosive Child. Deciding what are basket A, basket B, and basket C's. And I've worked with some parents where they want to throw everything into the basket A, and that's not how this is supposed to be presenting itself. Some things you want to, as overall issues, you want to negotiate, you want to work out some things, but there are certainly going to be some steadfast basket A rules that we're going to have, and we also want to consider basket C's. Depending on the issues that are going on with your child, it may be rolling your eyes and say, oh, that's a basket C thing. We're not real happy about it, but that's kind of the way things are. Next. So from least effective to most effective, sometimes walking away, setting expectations, setting limits. Least effective is, we don't want to, out yelling our teens, making threats. We don't want to meet anything with force. Again, we're looking at ourselves as being teachers. We're trying to help them work their way through this and express themselves in a much more appropriate way. Taken from William Miller, we certainly, when talking, we want to express empathy. Doesn't mean we're agreeing with them. We also want to get them to see their behavior, and that's where it goes back to the labeling, that you're right now, how you're presenting yourself is not going to, be an effective way to communicate your needs. Really want to avoid argumentation, roll with resistance. So a lot of the motivational interviewing techniques that Miller talks about could certainly be effective for the parents. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say adolescence is a war, but I think there are certain mindsets that we need to look at. And keeping in mind the limitations and all the things that we've talked about developmentally, emotionally, and otherwise, are things that we're trying to help our kids get through. Next. So we really want to start looking at anger tools. Again, reinforce focus on the anger. We want to also solidify commitments, and that's going to be through some costs and benefits. And we really want to start getting them to engage in a recovery plan. We also may want to be proactive with this. If we see certain situations that they have a very hard time with, those are things that we could prep them for. And by doing this, again, we're putting the focus on the anger or the inability to express the anger, and that will help them at least make some associations and connections with, with their emotions and again, how they're presenting themselves. Next. So the point of redirect for a parent, you want to, the longer the argument continues, the more the behavior continues, the more the physiological response is going to be increasing, and the harder it is for them to calm themselves down and actually address these things logically. Next. So really what we want to do is to get the parent to stop with the arguing, focusing on the behavior and helping that child negotiate negotiate and communicate in a much more effective way. So the sooner we're able to do that, the less the physiological responses will be coming in. Next. So some reminders: letting go, stepping back, letting your child do their own problem solving. It's going to be a learning period and they're practicing to be adults. We really want to respond versus react. Be available if your child needs you, and recognize cues. There's times where or a parent may be able to see an anger build up sooner than their child may actually be able to. Next. So adolescent tools are kind of tough because there has to also be a buy-in, with this. There has to be a recognition of that there is a problem. Kids who develop anger management issues, there's an activating event. There's usually a thought, a physiological response to that, and a behavior that precedes that next. And for kids who have anger management problems, it all seems to happen spontaneously. And we really want to get them to understand and to separate thoughts that may be associated with it, physiological responses, and what I mentioned before about some activating events that may precipitate that. Next. What I've had some parents do is keep their own logs for when they see their child getting and experiencing this anger. That may help them see how the patterns went, and this is information that would be helpful to have conversations with, not necessarily going over the log, but just presenting the insight of this is the information. This is kind of what I'm seeing. You've had particularly a hard time right after school, or when you go out with certain friends, or bedtime, whatever it is. We're able to gather more information, as a parent, and hopefully be able to present that in a constructive way to the adolescent. Next. We don't want to create a hostile environment. We really want to look for productive ways to express the anger. And if the child is making an association, and this goes to being proactive, of trying to engage in positive pursuits with the child as best as you can. Because when they make the association, mom or dad are walking towards me, they may associate that with another argument, and their physiological response could start escalating. Next. So we also want to look at what thoughts are attributed to that, using some how they viewing things, how they looking at things, how they making these connections, and getting them to recognize it. Next. I think most of us are familiar with some thinking errors, maybe even going over and coming up with your own, with it, coming up with your own names. These are tools that a parent may be able to or should be able to present to their child, to get them to see, how they, how their thinking could contribute to the issue. Next. Timing is certainly going to be important. That we really want to, be proactive as a parent in helping them understand that, as well as getting a child to understand there are going to be more constructive times to present or to address their anger. Next. We've introduced anger thermostats. These are discussions and dialogues a parent could get in with their child. Boy, this seems to be really where you seem to have more of a harder or more difficult time. And this could all be a part of the, getting the child to understand and make some of these connections and look for patterns as well. And it's also some things for the parents to be able to see when their point of redirect may be able to come in. The most important, or one of the more important things to keep in mind is getting a child to buy into this. And usually a buy-in factor is going to be where they see some costs associated with their anger. The benefits they may see, as I discussed before, would be getting parents to back off, people to be intimidated by them. But once they start seeing some costs, or they may not see the benefits associated with with anger. You may get more investment and change with them. And certainly understand kids are and teenagers are, we talked about, a much different developmental phase than adults. Our value systems are a lot different than an adolescent. I mean, if you guys think about it, when you were 16 years old, when your parents said to you, "Hey, you got to be home for curfew," out of those, how did you respond? Did you say, "Hey, Mom and Dad, that's a great idea. I think I'm going to be home at curfew"? No, most likely you didn't buy into that or didn't agree with that, or that wasn't a strong value. But as you got older and became a parent, you realize that there's really not a whole lot of good things that happen after curfew. And that's a value system. That's your value telling your child, and a child and an adolescent is not going to buy into that same value. What they may do, and what they'll probably, what you really want them to do, is to buy into the, to the behavior or consequence. I certainly know when I was younger, I didn't follow curfew because I thought it was a good idea, just because I didn't want to get grounded. And that's some things that we really want to keep in mind when we're getting in discussions and engaging with the kids. Is there comes a certain point where they're just not going to agree with our values, and then we need to kind of figure out the what nows. Next. So again, what we want to look at, is that this is a learning period. We want to get the parents to not get in the driver's seat, but kind of look at this as more like a driver's ed. I'm going to get in the passenger seat, and I could guide. We certainly need to keep in mind safety issues when things do get out of control, or make sure things don't. But we're looking at our points of assertion. When can we redirect, how, and in what manner? And oftentimes, it's a mindset, knowing that this is going to be a journey, and through this journey, we're getting our kids to better understand and better manage their anger. I think that covers my end on that, and I think we have some time for some questions and answers here.
Okay, so we are going to go over some questions now. Okay, so the first question we have is, if a child who struggled with his anger and all the stages that follows, such as aggression and physical altercations, now that the child is in his late teens and is an early adult who continues to exhibit the same issues with anger and all that follows. The question is, can he truly learn how to control his anger at late?
Sure if that means I'm supposed to go or not, but I'll hopefully I'm not interrupting anyone. So the question is can he truly learn how to control his anger at this late stage? We really want to look at foundation work. I think it's going to be a lot of consistency. We certainly, the sooner you address this anger issue, the more the helpful it's going to be. But I don't think it's ever too late. I work with adults, who come to me in 30s, 40s, 50 years old, who talk about wanting to change their ways they present their anger. So I don't think it's always too late. I think the longer it goes, the harder it may be. And again, it all goes back into investment into change.
Okay, the next.
Okay, so one of the questions is walking away. What do you do if your child follows you around the house and seems to get more angry by being ignored? In general, I would say is you certainly want to be consistent. You want to disengage as best as you can. But if an adolescent is following you around, is again what I've referred to before, safety issues. You want to make sure you're safe, and if you feel threatened in any way, you may need to call the police. If they seem to be getting more angry, you want to redirect and let them know and give them the opportunity, to manage their anger and to pull back. If a child is getting very aggressive, you certainly would need to address that, and it goes back to the safety part. So walking away for some, that may just tick them off even more, but it's how you're able to disengage, and if they're following you around and they're getting more angry, depending on how they're getting angry, with that. And it really would depend on each child and what they may respond to. But again, is looking at it from the perspective is they're really struggling with what they're trying to communicate with, and we're trying to help them get through that. What are some of the best coping mechanisms used to de-escalate anger? Do you prescribe to diaphragmatic breathing? Yeah, excellent question. Yes, there's a whole bunch of what this presentation did, and we could probably do several more hours on the how-tos. So this talked more about the parent perspective, but as far as the breathing, I certainly prescribe to that. I've prescribed to medication, meditation, excuse me, sometimes medication. Meditation, relaxation techniques, imagery, those are all very important parts, and those are things for the adolescent to be able to use. And so as far as some of the breathing, again, depending on how it's introduced by the parent, if we get a buy-in factor from the kid and saying, yes, I see this as a problem, and we may be able to help them by identifying that you are in an anger moment. If you do, let's do some breathing techniques, and then you're able to present this in a much clearer way. So yes, I do prescribe to that. That would be more of for most cases, an adolescent tool to use when you have the motivation to work on this. Not sure if we're waiting for another question.
So I believe that will conclude this this webinar. And if you do have any questions or you would like to get the presentation in full,
I'll just keep talking about the breathing techniques and other types of coping mechanisms. I use thought stopping, thinking errors. I've used the adolescent, the thermostat as well. And again, if there's an investment in change, those are much easier tools to get a child to buy or an adolescent to buy into. Okay, well, unless there's any other questions that I see pop up here, I know we went through a whole lot of information, with it, but just getting a basic understanding of the adolescents, the physiological responses to it, parent roles and parent interventions, and then we really want to, hopefully see a kid or a child investing into the change part. And there's where some of the tools would come in.
Okay, so this will conclude our webinar. If you do have any...
Again, thank you very much, and hope you guys enjoyed the webinar.
For all questions and or to receive the presentation in full, please write us at ceu@sovhealth.com. Thank you so much for attending our webinar today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.